In this screencast, we're going to actively recap and review all of the work that we've covered so far for the Youth Cultures section of the Component 1 A-Level Sociology exam. And what I'm trying to model through this particular video is the importance of space practice. So space practice is where you make sure that you go back and study important older information to keep it fresh. So let's begin by actively reviewing some of the key ideas that we looked at during our introduction to this topic. So during the first few lessons on this topic, we focused on the two things that you can see on this particular slide. So we examined the idea that youth is socially constructed, and we described the concepts of youth culture and youth subculture. Now, youth is usually defined as the period of life between childhood and adulthood. In other words, it is an in-between or liminal life stage. Now, one of the things that we said early on in the course is this category of youth is in fact a social construction. So as your first bit of active recall, I'd like you to have a go at writing a few sentences in answer to the question that you can see on the top of the slide. What might it mean to say that the idea of youth is in fact a social construction? So hit the pause button and write a few sentences. So when we say that youth is a social construction, what we're saying is that the idea of youth and the experience of being a young person is not universal. The experience of being a young person varies a great deal across time. For example, one only needs to look at this particular photograph and also read this quote at the bottom of the slide to immediately see that the experience of youth in our own society has changed significantly over time. And the experience of youth also varies across space. And what I mean by that is the experience of being a young person can be completely different depending on the country and the culture that you're being brought up in. As I mentioned a moment ago, what we also did in our first few lessons on this particular topic is we introduced the concept of youth culture and the concept of a youth subculture. So as your next bit of active recall, I'd like you to write down a definition of those two terms, youth culture and youth subculture. So hit the pause button and write down your definitions now. So firstly, this idea of a youth culture is the idea that if we look at young people as a whole, they tend to have certain habits, certain norms and values, certain ways of dressing, certain forms of slang and speech, which collectively make up a distinctive and separate cultural world from that of either adulthood or childhood. And then the concept of youth subculture has been used to describe the distinctive groups of young people who exist within the wider youth culture. So we're talking about groups of young people who particularly stand out in terms of things like their style, their dress, their music taste, their attitudes. And many sociologists would argue that youth subcultures very often reflect the social background of the participants in that subculture. So they reflect things like social class, gender and ethnicity. And during the beginning of the course, you did some research on a range of spectacular youth subcultures. And the term spectacular youth subculture is a term that's been used to describe some of the most highly visible subcultures of the 1950s to the 1980s. So I think we looked at examples such as the Teddy Boys, the Mods, the Skinheads, and the punk youth subcultures. After our introductory work, we then started to explore early research and theorising about youth cultures. And one of the first topics that we looked at during this section of the course was the functionalist perspective on youth cultures. So as your next piece of active recall, what I would like you to do is to hit the pause button and write a short paragraph explaining what you can remember about the functionalist perspective on youth cultures. So hit the pause button and write that paragraph now. The functionalist argument is that youth cultures in contemporary societies have a similar purpose to the role that rites of passage ceremonies have in more traditional cultures. So, for example, riding from a functionalist perspective, the American rider Talcott Parsons referred to youth culture as being like a bridge between childhood and adulthood. It is a rite of passage for people before they become adults. It helps to ease that transition. So functionalists argue that youth cultures perform two main functions within contemporary societies. Firstly, they help young people learn how to become adults. So, for example, young people learn through their membership of a youth culture to become much more independent and more detached from their family and their parents. Secondly, youth cultures can provide young people with the emotional support that they might need in order to ease the sometimes difficult transition from childhood into adulthood. So, for example, the functionalist writer Eisenstadt argued that youth culture bonds young people together. It creates a sense of community as they progress from the ascribed status given to them by their family and move towards an achieved status which they have to create for themselves. And functionalists are not really interested in the stylistic differences of different youth cultures or youth subcultures. And the reason for that is they would argue that the underlying function of all youth cultures, irrespective of their style, is essentially the same. The second theoretical perspective that we applied to the study of youth cultures was the Marxist perspective. And a lot of the earliest academic research and writing done on British youth subcultures was carried out by Marxists who were working within a university department known as the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham University. So what I'd like you to do next, as another bit of active recall, is hit the pause button and write another paragraph, seeing what you can recall from your long-term memory about this Marxist tradition in relation to British youth subcultures. So these Marxist sociologists were particularly interested in the role of working class youth subcultures, such as the skinhead youth subculture that we can see in this particular photo. And the basic argument is that young working class people are reacting to the exploitation and inequality that characterises a capitalist society. So these issues are reflected in the style and meaning of these working class youth subcultures. So their key argument is that working class youth create distinctive youth subcultures as an act of cultural resistance, as a way of trying to rebel and resist the norms and values of capitalism and the position of working class people within that system. And these Marxist sociologists claimed that they could decode the underlying subversive meaning of these working class youth subcultures through their use of semiotic analysis. So from this perspective, the skinhead working class youth subculture that first emerged in the East End of London in the late 1960s could be seen as an attempt to preserve a working class identity which at the time was thought to be under threat. So from this perspective, skinheads were therefore symbolically resisting the marginalisation of the working class by appropriating a uniform that was essentially a caricatured version of a manual working class identity. Remember that Marxists argue that the most important part of any society is the economic base, is the way in which the economy is organised, and from this Marxist perspective, the organisation of the economy affects everything else that goes on within society, including its culture. And in the decades following the end of World War II, the British capitalist economy started to change significantly. So there were technological developments that led to change, such as containerization, which had a massive impact on the jobs and livelihoods of people from working class backgrounds. And also we saw the influx of immigration from places like the Caribbean and then the Indian subcontinent in the decades following World War II. So from a Marxist perspective, we have to understand the development of a particular youth subculture, such as the skinhead youth subculture, as being a reaction to these economic changes. Another youth subculture that we interpreted from a Marxist perspective was the punk youth subculture of the mid to late 1970s. And according to Hebdige, the punk youth subculture culturally resisted capitalism by rejecting consumerism in favour of a do-it-yourself or DIY ethos. The next youth cultures topic that we considered was the influence of ethnic minorities on British youth culture. And what I would like you to do next, as part of your active recall of youth culture, is to write me a short paragraph explaining why migration from the Caribbean, migration from Caribbean islands such as Jamaica following World War II, why has that been one of the most significant influences on British youth culture? So hit the pause button and write a short paragraph explaining why migration from the Caribbean has had such a tremendous impact on British youth culture. And of course, many genres of music, many forms of slang, many types of fashion have been shaped by the influence of Afro-Caribbean culture, particularly Jamaican culture. And these Caribbean cultural styles have been adopted by many young people in the UK, not simply youth that have an Afro-Caribbean heritage. And hybrid cultures now exist which combine UK popular styles with minority ethnic culture. The hip-hop writer Trisha Rose describes how music and other elements of youth culture often provide a critical source of political expression for ethnic minorities in the context of oppression. She writes, under social conditions in which sustained frontal attacks on powerful groups are strategically unwise or successfully constrained, oppressed people use language, dance and music to mock those in power, to express rage and produce fantasies of subversion. And in class, we considered some of these issues by looking at the so-called rebel generation of black youths in the 1970s who refused to tolerate the things that their parents had tolerated in the 1950s and 1960s when they first arrived in Britain. And in particular, we looked at some of the ways in which black youth in the 1970s use reggae music and the signs and symbols of Rastafarianism as resources for resistance to white culture and racism in this period of British history. The next topic that we looked at was gender and youth cultures, and we started this topic by looking at some of the reasons why youth cultures are often seen as being more masculine than feminine. So what I'd like you to do next is hit the pause button again and see if you can identify in bullet point format 3 or 4 reasons why youth cultures are often seen as being more masculine than feminine. So hit the pause button and do that now. So let me go through some of the reasons that you might have identified. So firstly, many youth cultures are often seen as masculine because most of the early research into youth subcultures has focused on spectacular and deviant youth subcultures centered on males. And from a feminist perspective, this type of research has led to the invisibility of girls in the academic study of youth subcultures. And in addition to this bias within sociological research, you've also got the media who have also tended to portray youth cultures as masculine and violent because of the sensationalist element that makes interesting reading. And McRobbie and Garby argue that the relative absence of girls in spectacular street-based subcultures can be attributed to things like the stricter parental control and regulation of girls' leisure time. And they further argue that because of this, girls find alternative strategies to that of the boys' subcultures, and in particular, they documented a teeny bopper culture that was constructed around the territory available to girls, the home and the bedroom. Perhaps a key turning point in the involvement of girls in British youth subcultures was the punk youth subculture, because many feminists have highlighted the various ways in which this particular youth subculture allowed women to resist many of the traditional feminine stereotypes that existed at that time. After looking at the early research on youth cultures, we started to look at more recent research and theory on youth cultures, and where we had got up to was considering the so-called post-subcultural approaches to the study of youth cultures. And a reminder that the term post-subcultural theory is the term that Bennett and Harris have used to describe more recent studies of youth cultures that have been heavily influenced by the postmodernist theoretical perspective. One of the key arguments that postmodernists make about society is that we've undergone a process of individualization, and this describes a society where individual people have much more freedom to make life choices and to shape their identities due to a weakening of the traditional forms of social identity, such as social class. So from this perspective, young people continue to speak about themselves through their fashion and style, but the idea is that this nowadays is much more of an individual statement rather than a statement about belonging to a group like a particular youth subculture that was based on a particular social class. And postmodernists argue that these days youth cultures and identities are so short-lived and change so quickly that they are now much more a statement of style, fashion and consumption rather than anything meaningful in cultural terms. So they argue that young people are making statements of style and fashion rather than constructing youth cultures as a form of resistance. And if you remember in class, we started to apply some of these postmodernist ideas to the example of the dance music club cultures that emerged in the late 80s and early 1990s. And some of the sociologists who studied these dance music club cultures started to argue that the term youth subculture was no longer particularly relevant when describing the cultural activities of the young. And Andy Bennett has advocated the use of the term neo-tribe as a replacement for the term youth subculture. So Bennett argues that the term youth subculture is now past its sell-by date, and he argues this because he believes that it is no longer the case that young people form a cohesive and fixed youth subculture formed around fixed identities like class, gender and ethnicity. So this type of youth subculture that we can see here, for example the skinhead youth subculture, where people belong to a particular group all of the time, where people didn't really move from one group to another, they stayed very much within their group's parameters, where people belonged to a group because they shared a similar social class background. This is now very much a thing of the past, according to Bennett. And Bennett uses the term neo-tribe to describe the cultural activities of the young rather than the term subculture. And this is because Bennett argues that youth cultures are far less distinct, more varied, less well defined than they were in the past, and that young people now actively make consumer choices to identify themselves for short periods of time with a range of different groups which they move between. So whereas in the past an individual may have identified with just one particular subculture to the exclusion of other groups, nowadays, according to Bennett's research, young people are likely to have loose attachments to a range of different groups or neo-tribes that they move between. If you found any of these topics difficult during this active review, I would encourage you to go back to the original screencasts and to re-watch screencasts on topics that you find difficult. Remember, the purpose of creating these screencasts is to give you essentially a teacher on demand so that you can revisit and review topics whenever you need to.